Medusa was never meant to be just a monster. She was created, crafted by the gods themselves as a weapon of terror, a creature so horrifying that even the immortals feared her. This is the forgotten truth behind Medusa, the monster the gods wanted you to fear, and it begins with the first fear. In the ancient world, before Medusa became the monster of myth, there was a time when the gods walked among men and could shape lives with a mere thought. In Greece, centuries before her transformation, her beauty was so captivating, it caught the attention of even the most powerful of gods, Poseidon, god of the sea. Medusa was once a priestess in Athena's temple, sworn to purity and service. But when Poseidon, consumed by desire, violated the temple, Medusa became the target of Athena's wrath. Instead of punishing Poseidon, Athena cursed Medusa, transforming her into a monster. The first sign of her curse wasn't snakes or a deadly gaze, it was more subtle. One day, a herd of sheep was found in the fields, frozen and turned to stone, their expressions locked in terror. No natural force could explain it. Whispers spread that something ancient and unnatural had taken root in the temple, and Medusa was believed to be the source. Her once beautiful appearance had become the most deadly weapon, her gaze now capable of turning any living creature to stone. The villagers, once reverent of her, now feared her. The stories of the curse spread, and Medusa's transformation into a creature of horror became a warning, a divine reminder of the gods' unpredictable cruelty. But something else was stirring beneath the surface. In ancient Greece, the gods were woven into daily life, worshipped in temples where rituals were performed to seek their favor. Among the most revered was Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, whose temple in Athens was a sanctuary for the faithful. The people believed the gods controlled everything, from the sun's rise to the harvest, trusting in divine protection. One misty evening during a sacred ritual at her temple, Medusa's story began to twist. As priests and priestesses gathered, their faces flickering in candlelight, they offered prayers of thanks for the harvest. The air was thick with incense and chants of reverence. Yet beneath the peace, a growing unease lingered. The shadows flickered unnaturally, and the wind howled through the temple's cracks. Though no one dared speak of it, there was an undeniable sense that something dark was stirring in the heart of their sacred rites. The rituals that had once brought peace now felt empty, as if they were being observed by unseen eyes. The people continued to gather, lighting candles and laying offerings at the altar, but the ceremonies no longer carried the weight of reverence they once had. Medusa, once a devout servant of Athena, was growing distant from the rituals. The very act of lighting candles, once a symbol of purity and devotion, now felt like a mockery of the divine. She was caught in a limbo between her own humanity and the gods' expectations of her. As Medusa's transformation progressed, the effects of the curse were beginning to spread. The once peaceful land began to feel the weight of her newfound powers. The harvest began to fail. Crops once vibrant and bountiful now withered under the shadow of the curse. Livestock were found dead in the fields, their bodies frozen, their eyes wide open in terror. People whispered that it was the work of Medusa's gaze, her very presence turning the land to stone, as her curse was not just one of appearance, but of power. The villagers grew uneasy, unsure of what to believe. They had seen the once beautiful woman Medusa become a creature of legend, her hair twisting into snakes, her gaze forever deadly. And they had seen the land around her transform into something unrecognizable, as though nature itself had turned against them. The very rituals that had been meant to protect them now seemed hollow, useless. It was as if the gods had left them to fend for themselves, and in the face of Medusa's curse, there was nothing they could do to stop it. As the mist thickened on the fields and the shadows grew deeper in the temple, the first seeds of dread were planted. The gods, once seen as benevolent protectors, had turned their backs on the people. Athena's once pure temple had become a place of silent fear, a reminder that the gods were not infallible and that their wrath could be more terrible than anyone had ever imagined. But what was worse than the growing dread was the knowledge that they had unknowingly invoked it. They had worshipped the gods with blind devotion, never questioning the cost of their power. They had been lulled into a false sense of comfort by their rituals, not knowing that their very acts of reverence had paved the way for the curse of Medusa to take root. And as the curse began to spread, something far more terrifying was rising from the shadows of their own faith. The first signs that something was wrong were subtle, but they spread quickly, like cracks in the foundation of a building. At first, the villagers dismissed the strange occurrences as coincidence, as something beyond their control, a bad season perhaps, or the anger of the gods. But as the events began to escalate, it became clear that something far darker was at work. The first real shock came when the village's livestock began to fall ill. Cattle, goats, and sheep were found dead, their bodies mutilated and strangely cold to the touch. Their eyes, wide and glassy, seemed frozen in terror, but there were no signs of injury, no predator's mark, no bite. They were found in the fields, scattered across the land like statues, as though they had been turned to stone in the moment of death. The farmers were baffled, unable to explain what had happened to the animals. The fear began to set in. There were whispers among the villagers that the curse of Medusa had reached them, that her very gaze was turning the land to stone. The crops, too, began to fail. Fields that had once yielded bountiful harvests now stood bare. The crops withered and stunted, their leaves shriveled and brown. The priests who had once offered prayers for a prosperous season now stood in the fields, helpless. The soil itself seemed to have turned against them. The winds no longer carried the scent of fresh earth. Instead, they carried a coldness, an unnatural chill that cut through the village. The ground itself seemed cursed, as though the land itself was refusing to nourish the people. But the true signs of something deeply wrong were far more personal. The first came with the birth of a child born under the full moon. The villagers had been preparing for the annual harvest celebration when they learned that the midwife had delivered a baby with unusual features. The child's skin was pale, nearly translucent, and its eyes, though small, gleamed an unnatural shade of yellow, like that of a predator. Its fingers were tipped with tiny claws, and its body, though small, was unnervingly strong. The baby cried out, but it wasn't the cry of a normal infant. It was a guttural, almost animalistic sound that chilled those who heard it. The mother, distraught and terrified, couldn't explain the strange nature of her child. The midwife, trembling as she held the baby, whispered that it was a sign of something cursed, something marked by the gods. But the villagers, unsure of what to believe, began to speak in hushed tones. Had this child been marked by Medusa's curse? Was it a reflection of the dark power she had unleashed? The suspicion grew as more children were born with odd features, some with strange deformities, others with eyes that seemed too large or too wild, their behavior more animal than human. Then came the sickness. It started with a few villagers, those closest to the forest, those who had ventured into the woods in search of wood or herbs. At first it seemed like an ordinary fever, high temperature, shaking hands, and a sense of weakness. But as the sickness spread, it became far worse. People began to cough up strange, blackened blood. Their skin turned pale, their lips cracked and dry, as if the life was draining from them. There were no explanations, no medicine that could cure the sickness, no herb that could ease the pain. It spread quickly, and those who were afflicted often died within days, their bodies frozen in place as though they had turned to stone. It was as if the curse was creeping into their very bones, freezing them from the inside out. But what truly unsettled the villagers was not the sickness or the strange births. It was the behavior of those who had been touched by the curse. They began to act strangely, as if they were no longer fully themselves. Those marked by the curse would stare into the distance for hours, their eyes glazed over, unblinking. They would speak in cryptic phrases, muttering things they couldn't understand. Some would even wander into the woods at night, never to return. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, asking the question that had begun to gnaw at them all. Who, among them, was truly marked? The curse had taken root, and now they all feared the inevitable. One by one, they would all be touched by its power. But as the sickness spread and the land grew colder, the truth became clear. The curse was not only among them, it was inside them. That was only the first crack in the story. As the days stretched on, the once thriving village began to feel like a place caught in the grip of some ancient curse. What began as whispers of fear soon became full-blown panic. The village, once a close-knit community, began to turn on itself, its foundation cracked by suspicion and dread. The air was thick with unease, a weight that seemed to press down on everyone who lived there. The livestock continued to die. No explanation, no predator, just death, sudden, brutal, and terrifying. The bodies of cattle, sheep, and goats were found mutilated, their flesh torn in ways that suggested something far stronger than a wolf or wild animal. The blood was drained from their bodies, and their eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, were locked in a permanent stare of horror. It wasn't just the animals that had become victims. It was the land itself. The crops, once fertile and plentiful, stood withered in the fields. Wheat, once golden and full of life, now lay brittle and blackened, as though scorched by fire. The villagers could do nothing. No amount of prayer, no offerings to the gods could reverse the devastation. Their world was crumbling before their eyes. It wasn't long before accusations began to fly. Neighbors who had once shared meals and laughter now eyed each other with suspicion. The illness, the strange births, and the deaths were too much to ignore. Who was responsible for this curse? Whose fault was it that the land had become barren, that the beasts of the earth had become unwilling sacrifices to something far darker? Some pointed to the old rituals, to the ceremonies they had performed to honor the gods. Had they angered them with their offerings? Had they unknowingly invoked the wrath of a forgotten god? Others blamed those who had strayed too far from the village and returned with marks of the curse upon them. There were rumors that those who had ventured into the forests and woods had brought back something with them, something that had latched onto the land, feeding off the fear and decay. But the suspicion didn't stop there. It spread like wildfire, turning neighbors against neighbors. Whispers of witchcraft, of ancient pacts with demons, began to surface. Villagers began to accuse each other of being cursed, of being the cause of the afflictions that had befallen them. The very air seemed to carry the weight of betrayal. No one was safe. Everyone was guilty until proven innocent. Those who had been touched by the curse, the ones who showed signs of strange behavior, the ones who had turned pale and cold, were looked at with growing fear. Some even took matters into their own hands, forming secret groups to hunt down those they suspected of harboring the curse, hoping to rid the village of the evil they believed was inside their own people. As if the physical horrors weren't enough, the atmosphere began to shift. Night after night, shadows moved in the darkness. At first, the villagers tried to ignore it, thought it was just the wind, the shifting trees, but then the shadows grew more distinct, more deliberate. Figures seemed to cross the edges of the village, moving too swiftly, too silently, to be human. They lingered just beyond the light, never seen clearly, only felt, a presence that made every footstep, every sound, seem a little more ominous than before. The night was no longer a time of rest. It was a time of terror, a time to lock doors and bolt windows, to listen for any sound that might signal the approach of something terrible. And then, one night, a scream shattered the quiet. A young woman who had once been full of life was found in the woods, her body frozen in place, her eyes wide open in terror, just like the livestock. No signs of a struggle, no clear cause of death, just the same terror, the same lifeless gaze. She had become another statue in the cursed land, And as the villagers gathered around her, they realized the horrifying truth. Whatever was happening was only just beginning. The curse had begun to feed on their fear, and it was growing stronger with every passing moment. The fear had spread, infecting everything. No one was safe, and no one had the strength to fight what was coming. And from there, everything grew darker. As the village fell deeper into despair, the people began to fight back with whatever they had left, hopeless measures that only amplified the sense of inevitability. In the face of the mounting horrors, they turned to the old ways, rituals that had been passed down through generations. But nothing seemed to work. Every attempt to protect themselves only reminded them how powerless they truly were. The first line of defense was the simplest: garlic. Its pungent scent had long been believed to ward off evil, and the villagers, desperate for any reprieve, began hanging garlic cloves above doors and windows. They placed it around the perimeter of their homes, hoping the smell would deter whatever force had taken hold of their land. But even as they did this, a gnawing sense of futility set in. They had heard the stories, the ancient ones who had used these rituals against vampires, demons, and other creatures of the night. But garlic alone wasn't enough to defeat the curse that was growing stronger by the day. It was a bandage over a wound that was far too deep. Next came salt. The villagers scattered it in lines around their homes, creating a barrier they hoped would keep the curse at bay. The superstition was simple. Salt was purifying, a way to separate the living from the dead. But it didn't stop the shadows that moved in the woods. It didn't stop the strange markings that appeared on the bodies of the dead, or the eyes of the living that began to take on that same unsettling, predatory look. The salt was a small comfort, but comfort was not enough. The villagers could feel it now. The curse was here to stay, and their small efforts were like trying to hold back a flood with a handful of dirt. Rituals, too, became more frequent. Sacred nights where the villagers gathered to perform elaborate ceremonies, meant to appease the gods and drive away the evil that had descended upon them. The priestess, once a figure of wisdom, now led these gatherings with trembling hands, her voice faltering as she recited prayers. The people, once hopeful that these rituals would protect them, now saw them as their last chance for survival. But even in the glow of the ceremonial fires, the air felt heavy, thick with the sense that the gods were no longer listening. The rituals grew more desperate. Blood sacrifices were offered in the hopes that the gods would intervene. The villagers would gather in the dark of night, chanting words in ancient tongues, their faces lit only by the flickering flames. The air was thick with smoke and incense, but it did little to lift the oppressive atmosphere. The land was already marked. The shadows, ever present in the corners of the village, seemed to watch them, silent, waiting. It was during one such sacred night in the thick of the woods where the trees stood like sentinels that a group of villagers, led by the elder priestess, performed the darkest ritual of all. They had heard of an ancient incantation, one that was said to summon the spirits of the dead and allow the living to communicate with them. The idea was that they could ask the spirits for guidance, for knowledge of how to break the curse. It was an act of desperation, a step further into the unknown, but they had no other choice. They gathered around a massive stone circle deep in the forest, the air unnaturally cold, the night sky devoid of stars. The chanting grew louder, the air crackling with energy. As the final words were spoken, the earth beneath them seemed to shift. The wind howled and the ground trembled. They had crossed a line, invoked a force far darker than they had anticipated. The veil between the living and the dead was thin, and in that moment, they realized they had opened a door that should never have been touched. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, twisted, and unfamiliar. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, its form shifting between the shape of a man and something far more monstrous. The villagers froze, their hearts racing as the creature stepped forward, the earth beneath it cracking and breaking apart. They had done what they thought was necessary, but they had not considered the cost. And that moment opened a door that should have stayed closed, As the days grew darker, the village descended further into chaos. The curse that had plagued them seemed to find new ways to spread, and with each passing night the bodies of the dead grew more numerous. The villagers, once bound by tradition, now found themselves struggling to preserve what little remained of their humanity. But there was one truth they could no longer deny. Death, once a release from suffering, had become a doorway to something far worse. The manner of the deaths, their violent, unnatural end, left the souls of the dead restless. The first few deaths had been sudden, unexpected, but as the curse intensified, the bodies of the fallen began to twist and contort in ways that should not have been possible. The villagers turned to their ancient burial rituals, rituals designed to pin the dead to the earth, to prevent their souls from returning. Stones, large and heavy, were placed over the bodies, meant to weigh them down, to keep them trapped in their graves. Nails were hammered through their hands and feet, securing the dead to the earth, ensuring they could never rise again. For those believed to have been marked by the curse, stakes were driven through their hearts to ensure their spirits were contained. But even these measures were not enough. The first sign of something deeply wrong came when a woman named Ilara, who had died during the height of the curse, was found not in her grave but at the edge of the village. Her body was twisted, her limbs unnaturally bent, her eyes wide open in terror. She had not been buried properly, her grave had been disturbed, and her return from death had become the first true sign that death was no longer an end, it was only a beginning. Ilara's body was reburied with even more care. The rituals were performed once again, the stones and nails secured with greater force. But as the villagers tried to find peace, they began to hear whispers in the dark, the sounds of the dead clawing at their graves, unwilling to stay buried. It wasn't just their bodies that returned, it was their restless souls trapped in a perpetual cycle of torment. The very earth seemed to reject them, pulling them back to the surface where they could never find rest. The fear grew because death, they now understood, was no longer final, because some of the dead refused to stay buried. The ground rumbled, and from the graves a low, scratching sound echoed through the night. The dead, once thought sealed, began to stir. Limbs twisted, eyes opened, and an eerie whisper filled the air. Then it rose, a creature, no longer human, no longer dead, its form a horrific blend of man and beast, driven by the curse that could never be broken. And some say, if you listen closely, you can hear it, scratching at the door, waiting for the next soul to claim, because what they buried was never meant to stay underground.